Let's talk nonsense on this episode of Pushback.
Go, 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 Jonny, go, 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 Jonny, go, 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 Jonny, go, go.
If you're concerned about the direction our culture is heading, then maybe it's time to push back.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Jonny, and this is another episode of Pushback. This could be kind of a short podcast. I don't know. I've been shaking my head ever since I've started writing this and preparing for this podcast. I've been talking about pseudoscience, and there's a degree of embarrassment that has been present because I am one. I am a scientist and I care deeply about my profession. I care deeply about science itself. I love science. It is so fascinating, and I'm so grateful that I've been able to make a career out of being a scientist. I'm a medical doctor, an ER doctor, and enjoy it. And some days are better than others. However, it's so critical and so important, and I feel like my job is valuable, and I care for people and literally save people's lives at times. What a privilege to be in that position. Science matters, and science has a great degree of influence on our culture, and it should. Technology and science are critical to the way we live and to the luxuries and labor-saving issues that technology and science gives us. But not only that, it's just the pulling back of the curtain and the discovery of God's creation is such an amazing phenomenon. Medical school just opened my eyes to the gloriousness, the hugeness of God and the intricacy and detail of his creation. And I'm one of those things. I'm one of those details. And when we live life with that piece of identity in that place, what a privilege it is to be there. And so when things come up against science, and we've been talking about this in this season of a series about protecting our children, how culture is influencing our children. And science is a big piece of that. And I've been calling it pseudoscience because when we move out of the realm of science into the realm of religion, into the realm of activism, into the realm of politics, it's a different thing altogether. And we need to call it what it is. And I've been fired up, and I've not really been holding back my words regarding the scientific community and the responsibility that they carry to present objective truth. That's their role in our society, the role in our culture. And when they move away from that, it's just something else. It's not science. It's pseudoscience. They can call it what they want. They can have a name tag. They can wear a white coat. They can look through a magnifying glass. Does not make them a scientist if they're not following scientific principles and presenting information to the public accurately. So that's where we stand, and I believe it's so important as we go forward in these discussions. Last week I talked about the transgender affirming care. I think it's such an interesting title because even the word affirmation speaks about feelings and emotions. They're saying that if we give you puberty blockers, if we remove your breasts, if we surgically remove testicles, if we change hormones, if we do these things to children, that they're going to be affirmed in their feelings, in their emotions. It's craziness, and it's actually malpractice. And I made the case for that. I believe it's going to be one of the greatest scandals over the next 10 to 20 years as studies come out that this is extremely harmful to children, and that I believe the statistics I gave, 80% of these gender confusion issues take care of themselves by the time they're in their late teens anyway. And so as I look towards my own profession, I feel grieved, I feel sad, I feel embarrassed because I believe that the medical community is jumping in both feet to this woke ideology because that's where their funding comes from. That's where it's all about politics. If you don't fall in line, you get criticized, you get ostracized, you get removed, you get defunded. And those are powerful motivators, especially for CEOs in positions of medical authority. And that's where we find ourselves. And it's the objective scientific community that needs to stand up and be the ones that say this supersedes sensibility. And so I want to talk about, I believe briefly, because this is such a black and white issue in my opinion, about this issue of being non-binary, of male and female. This directly connects to my profession, because surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, depending on how you look at it and how jaded you've become, this has injected itself even into a medical community that deals with human bodies. It just makes me scratch my head and go, what is going on here? So what is non-binary? Non-binary people may identify as an intermediate or separate third gender. So that definition in and of itself makes no sense to me, because non-binary is saying that they're just something else. They're non. Binary refers to having two parts, male and female. And they're just saying they're non. So they can't really use the word gender. A third gender doesn't make sense, because if they're agender, they're non-gender, according to the way they feel. They identify more with one gender or no gender, or have a fluctuating gender identity. Gender identity is separate from sexual or romantic orientation. Non-binary people have various sexual orientations. Now, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, and I'm not trying to be irreverent, and I'm not trying to hurt anybody. But that definition makes no sense to me. It is nonsense. It is not non-binary, it's nonsense. Unless the highest form of human ability and reason are emotions and feelings. If that's true, then maybe this does make sense, because it is whatever you feel like you want it to be. And yet here I am as a scientist, and I know that I can speak genetically that there are two parts, male and female. There are two separate sexes, two separate genders that we see and that we study and that we can prove, and we can show why that is the case chromosomally. As Christians, it's a very short discussion, which is why this is probably a short podcast. In Genesis chapter 1, then God said, "Let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created him binary. That's what the Bible says. He created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over everything that moves on the earth." So we as Christians, if we believe the Bible, we believe Genesis chapter 1, we believe that we were made male and female, we were made binary, we were supposed to reproduce, fill the earth, and reproduce God's culture over the face of the earth. So that was his plan, Selah. That's the end of the discussion. We usually don't have to have much more of a discussion about that. It just makes sense. So let's switch into the scientific realm in which I live. I'm a medical professional. I'm stunned and in disbelief that I'm even having this discussion, to be honest with you. That we're discussing, is it possible to not be male or female? Just something else, non-binary. And medically, obviously, there is no other third gender. There's nothing that we've ever studied. There's no genetic component. There's no biological component. There's no anatomical component that we can say is just different. We can't objectively affirm this finding, this assertion, this attempt to be something else. We can't affirm that, biologically speaking, scientifically speaking. In our anatomy class in medical school, and some of you may have a hard time hearing this, we studied cadavers. People donated their bodies to medical science so that we can study them. We can see the human body in 3 dimensions, and we can touch it, and we can dissect it, and we can see it. It's an incredible donation. It's an incredible gift that we are so grateful for. And we showed our gratitude and understood that this was for science. And we would work on these cadavers. We were in a group and we had the same cadaver for months and months. And we went through different systems and we dissected this cadaver and learned all the different pieces and parts of the intricacy of the human body. You can imagine by the end of our anatomy class, this body was very dissected and sometimes unrecognizable because it was dissected. I'm sorry if this is too gruesome for some people. But we would also have anatomy tests. We would be tested on this, and they would use the cadavers, and we would go from station to station, from cadaver to cadaver, and there would be a little pin in a certain anatomic component of this cadaver, and we had to identify what we were looking at. Well, by the end of the anatomy class, again, these cadavers were very dissected. It was hard to always tell what we were looking at. And so it was almost comical that the time would go off, we'd go to the next station. Every person would first look at the head of the cadaver to see if it's face up or face down, because that would help us. And then we looked between their legs to understand if there was male or female. Because that would help us anatomically, because males and females are anatomically different. And so every station, we'd look at the head and we'd look between the legs before we even look at the pin and what we were supposed to look at, because it helped cue us in, because we knew that the cadaver was binary. It was either a male or a female. It wasn't something else. There were no surprises. There was no third or separate gender. It was clear. It was black and white. It was interesting because in medicine, historically, this just fascinates me. It's been activism and politics that have actually began to inject itself into science to achieve an outcome. There's DSM criteria. DSM is this Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's been around for 50, 60, maybe even more years. I think we're on now the DSM-5, but in 1974 it was the DSM-2, and homosexuality was listed as a mental disorder. It had always been listed as a mental disorder. It's interesting, if you go to Wikipedia and you ask the question to Wikipedia, why was homosexuality removed from the DSM-2? They would say, quote, "The change was a compromise between competing schools of thought within the psychiatry field. The view that homosexuality was a pathological condition and the view that homosexuality is a normal variation of sexuality." That is in a completely made up sentence with no scientific backing or reference. This was a cover-up from the reality of what is true. And it's interesting because the gay activists also would roll their eyes at that sentence because they want to take full credit for the change that took place in the DSM-2. Nearly 50 years ago, LGBTQ activists achieved what is called, quote, "the greatest gay victory of the time," successfully pushing members of the American Psychiatric Association to remove the diagnosis of homosexuality from the official classification of mental illness. By citing homosexuality as a mental illness, the APA and its members stigmatized LGBTQ people and non-normative sexualities and gender expressions. This is what they're writing. The campaign to remove the homosexuality diagnosis from the DSM began in earnest in the 1960s, backed by a growing civil rights, women's rights, and gay rights movement across the country. Dubbed as the homophile movement, gay and lesbian rights organizations in major cities like New York, San Francisco, and Philadelphia started to pressure elected officials and launch public campaigns, visibility, and rights. See, they don't want to take away their victory, even though the medical community is embarrassed by it because they were just simply campaigned out of truth. They were activisted, not a word. They were activisted out of objective truth. How embarrassing. Not by study, not by observation, not by reason, not by what they see with their own eyes, but because activists pressured them and pressured elected officials to pressure them to remove it a scientific understanding. Just because something becomes more common doesn't make it normal or healthy. This is about health. And I know that I have some angst in my voice because this is just feels like it's just common sense. But really, this is about the hearts of the people that are hurting. We've talked about this so many times in this podcast. It's not about me being right. It's not about what the Bible says. It's about the hearts of the people and helping them in a real and effective way. The Bible has a lot to say about that. It's our responsibility as scientists to stand up and say, now, wait a minute. We love these people. We care for them. We want to care for them in the highest quality way, in the healthiest way that we can. It's not a change and compromise between competing schools of thought. That was not the case in 1974. It was the result of activists and bowing a knee to political pressure. See, when pseudoscience steers the ship, the result is a loss of all credibility. We talked about this last week. It's about scientific credibility and scientific objective review. If we remove the standard of science, it is no longer science. It's called pseudoscience. And then you just simply become social activists, or you bow the knee to the godless religion. There's nothing more straightforward than simple genetics, XX versus XY. It's binary. We can study it. We can look at it. We can see it. Anthropologists could dig up your remains hundreds or thousands of years from now and tell if you were a man or a woman. It's objective. There's no feelings in a skeleton. It's an objective finding. It's male or it's female. I practice basic medicine based on gender. Am I not supposed to do that because I might hurt somebody's feelings? Boy, that would be scary for an ER physician, wouldn't it? Do I run a pregnancy test on any non-binary person or a man identifying as a woman? And do I do it to save their feelings? I mean, this is nonsense. What are we talking about here? This discussion is all about emotions and feelings, and I get it. I'm not trying to be unsympathetic to this idea that there's real hurting people with real hurting emotions and real hurt feelings. I do get that, but do we make our objective decisions scientifically based on those emotions and feelings? If we do, then it's not science. And honestly, I'd be okay with scientists just admitting that. I'm no longer a scientist, I'm an activist. This is what I believe, and so we throw objective findings to the wind. I believe my profession is at a precipice. I shared the statistic with you last week that a Pew Research study asking, do you have a great deal of trust in science, is down to 23%. That means 77% of people don't have a great deal of trust in science. How is that possible? It's science. It's objective finding and fact and research and study and observation. It's when common sense is up against nonsense. That's what happens, and that's what we're dealing with here. But I believe that our profession, I believe that the medical profession, I believe that scientists in general can stand up and show the fact. You can't argue with facts. Now, again, there's a whole category of faith. There's a whole category of believing what you don't see. And that's a huge tenet of what I believe in and what I follow as a Christian. And there's a big point of understanding and believing even without seeing or even without having objective fact. But that doesn't make objective fact and science evil. It's just a study of God's creation and what he has for us. What becomes evil is when we manipulate those things, we manipulate his creation into something that doesn't even exist and actually ends up hurting people, and we end up treating people and caring for people outside of our scientific study and training. When that happens, that's scary. And I believe that's happening right now. So this podcast is a call to parents to have their eyes open, to children who are hurting and in need of help to find real help and real solutions. It's a call out to medical professionals to stand up and defend evidence-based medicine, which we've all been trained on. And for us to pursue truth as a community, to pursue truth as a culture, so that we are truly helping people and not pouring gasoline on a fire. I believe that we can do that. Thank you for listening to this podcast again this week. Hey, would you do me a favor? Would you go to pushbackculture.org and just check out my website? If you feel led, this is listener supported, and we need your donation and help. If you'd be willing to donate and financially support this podcast to go forward, I'd really appreciate that. If you'd be willing to go to gofam.org and check out our resources for family, because family and parenting are so critical to what we're doing here in this culture. We're looking for regular monthly supporters to contribute to our cause, because this isn't slowing down, this is ramping up. And I believe that I can just be one voice in this battle to bring sanity to our culture. And I'd like to continue to be that voice. So I'd appreciate you doing that. And I appreciate so much connecting with this and spreading the word about this podcast. So with that being said, let's go together now to set and shape the culture.